going to just say that on the mic. They'll probably hear me. Is this okay? Good afternoon, everybody. Is everybody ready for our session here? Why don't, if anybody, you could maybe move up a little bit more because it's kind of a big room and the crowd is really spaced out. We really would like everyone to ask questions if you have any questions. So we wanted to be more of an interactive discussion once we get started. You ready to tell your war stories, Ryan? All right, I guess we'll get started. Ready? All right. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Frank Reno. I'm a partner at Fisher Zucker. I've worked with Lane Fisher for almost 20 years now. At Fisher Zucker, I'm the litigation partner, so I handle all of the firm's litigation. That from the receiving demand notices, replying to demand notices, serving cease and desist, serving demand default notices on franchisees, and all the arbitrations, mediations, and litigation. We have a great panel today, and so I'm going to, because they all like to speak about themselves quite often, I'm going to let them all introduce themselves. So why don't you start, Tony?
Sure. I'm Tony Valley, managing partner, Clear Summit Group. We have a portfolio company of 7 brands at different stages, about half of them at emerging, half of them fairly mature. Been in France. Next year is my 40th year in franchising. So I live up in Toronto, Canada, and I guess we're talking about compliance today. The legal reports into me, so I have a little bit to talk about when we get to some of the Q&A.
Good afternoon. My name is Drew Chalfant. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Fran Devco. We're a franchise sales and development organization. We represent 10 different brands doing franchisee recruitment and operational and sales consulting for the brands. I'm a recovering franchise attorney. I spent the first part of my career as in-house counsel for other development companies as well as franchise brands before starting my own law firm where I was drafting FDDs and doing day-to-day compliance for brands. And I wasn't invited to these conferences back then because the Fisher Zucker boys didn't want anybody coming in and stealing clients from them. So now I'm on board at Fran Devco as our Chief Operating Officer, out of the legal role, back on the business development side, helping make sure that we've got the right brands in the portfolio, those brands are doing the right things, and just generally making sure the trains run on time.
Hello, my name is Anthony Palazzi. I'm the president and CEO of AP Franchise Concepts, which is a business that invests in and helps grow emerging franchise concepts. We've got 6 investments currently in a variety of restaurant, dog, and fitness brands. And our goal is basically to help these businesses. Usually we kind of get involved when they're 5 to 10, 15 units and help them grow up to the kind of 50 to 100 unit points and then look to give them, pass them along to somebody else. So that's kind of my role, and we look forward to discussing today a little bit about how to get those businesses, and keep them on track.
Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Wall. I am the CEO of Handyman Connection. It's my 35th year in franchising. So I started off with a company called College Pro Painters, where I was a painting franchisee for a couple years. 15 years full-time with them, a couple years with a sister company called Certa Pro Painters. Moved over to Handyman Connection and acquired the business from the parent company, First Service Brands, in 2013. Just me.
All right, and so if anybody, like I said, if anybody has any questions, please raise your hand. We welcome questions. And I was just going to add that if you have tough questions, I want you to ask them of Jeff Wall. All right, so compliance. Compliance is extremely important in a franchise system. It ensures that the brand is consistent, the same, so the customer knows what they're going to get when they go to the franchise location and purchase whatever it is the franchise is selling. So why don't we start off with discussing ways to ensure that franchisees are in compliance? What are some strategies, standard operating procedures, options? Why don't we start with Tony?
Great. I have a very specific strategy. Make sure you don't ever have compliance issues. I know that sounds, what does that sound like? Like I shouldn't be on this panel because you're talking about compliance issues. There's a hierarchy. The hierarchy is, I think we all know what we're doing when we're selling a franchise. We're basically giving them our baby to take care of locally, and it, in essence, is a trusted partnership. Anything else that we do is in support of trusted partnership, even when we have difficulty. So trust, character, competence, common sense of purpose, the franchise agreement has all of that in there. And and I think it takes about a year, and I'll let other people speak more technically, but I'm CEO of two of those concepts, and when things get to me on compliance, I go directly to, what was the original deal that we made, intellectually, emotionally, and contractually. And we go to that, and that always stems from what your business model is. Because all of us have different, or deal with businesses with different business models, and you're trying to keep compliance to the business model and the things that make it go. And so in terms of the trusted partnership and the compliance piece of it, business model is critical. Clarity, but it takes a franchisee about a year to understand what they're in. And so you're constantly working on that partnership and what that means in that relationship to make sure that when you have compliance issues, you're able to sit at the table and deal with them. So that's just, I'll hand it off, but that's just at a macro level. I put everything through a trusted partnership model because at one point we loved each other. And whether it's a few years in or 9 years in or in the first month, you always have to remember that we chose them, they chose us, and that's at the foundation of any compliance pieces. We have to remember, unless it's really harsh, and I think some people here can speak, I can as well, but really harsh situations, that's the core idea.
I'm a big believer that in any organization, whether it's your family and you're dealing with your children, or it's a large company, that you promote what you tolerate. So it's a cultural thing within an organization that franchising is a regulated industry, it is a litigious industry, and if you don't have a culture of compliance, if you don't have someone in the organization who is, I know a lot of you, especially if there are any emerging brands in the room, you certainly don't have the budget for an in-house legal department, but you definitely have the budget to kind of look and be self-aware and say, all right, who in this organization is going to be our chief compliance officer? Who is the buck going to stop with as far as our good record keeping, our good sales practices? If we need to have a relationship with outside counsel, who is that person going to be? Because I can tell you, I've seen it inside of companies, it gets punted. No one really wants to do it. It's not sexy, it's annoying. It's somebody walking around with the rule book telling you what to do, but somebody in the organization has to be that chief compliance officer, and it has to come from leadership that compliance is an important part of this organization, because otherwise it will start to fray at the ends, and before you know it, you'll look up and it's been punted and the can's been kicked so far down the road that your system is in disarray from a compliance standpoint.
Yeah, obviously some great comments there. I think what's interesting to me about the kind of compliance landscape is that, sometimes you sit back as a franchisor and say, well, why wouldn't they follow the rules, right? That's why they bought a franchise, right? Because they wanted our guidance on how to operate, right? So why wouldn't they follow the rules? Why wouldn't they, operate the way we tell them to or whatever? But, you have to understand that people come with a very varied variety of experience. They come with, different reactions to the situations they're in. They operate out of fear sometimes, So there's all kinds of reasons why people can decide that, to try and short circuit something or whatever. And so to me, a lot of, preventing compliance issues is around understanding your franchisee base and what's driving and motivating them, so that you can understand what's causing them to not, follow the standards you set out, and what you can do to get them back on track, before you have to go to the kind of more technical steps that we'll talk about in a bit.
Would you like me to comment?
Yeah, whatever.
I'm going to ask a question.
No, I was gonna say,
If I'm a new franchisor, compliance to what? How many pages is your franchise agreement? Ballpark. 100 plus. Franchise agreement?
Franchise agreements, 60, 70 pages.
So compliance
plus-
to everything?
Well, I think we should be clear too. Like, are we talking about system compliance as far as are your franchisees following what they're supposed to follow in their agreements, or are we talking more along the lines of are you as a franchisor complying with the things that you can and cannot do in the sales process? Are you complying with like the regulations that help me, where are we at here?
so that was my next question was, what about when the franchisor, or what are options to keep the franchisor from falling out of compliance? What strategies do they have? What checks and balances can you have in place, systems that are in place to ensure that the sales process is appropriate and that the franchisor is honoring its obligations under the franchise agreement in the training and the location approval and all those items?
Sure. Do you want to finish your thought on, I think,
Well,
you're talking system compliance.
I'm asking the question, if I'm a new franchisor in the room, I want to know what the hell we're talking about. Right? Are we complying to are you asking, how do you follow a 100-page franchise agreement? Or are we talking about the sales process? So, and then Frank, you just asked a different question, which was how do you make sure the franchisor is compliant? And I don't mean this in a smart-ass way. Our franchise agreement tries to put forth that we don't do much.
Right.
So it makes it easier for the franchisor to comply because we're in charge of the franchise agreement and our obligations are one page. We will train you. We will give you a system. That's about it.
Right, but a lot of franchisors have problems doing that, right? I have many cases where there are allegations that the franchisor didn't provide the training that they promised in the FDD, that they didn't give them an operations manual that matched what was in the FDD. The table of contents, for example, is different. Sometimes they don't even get operations manuals, if it's an emerging brand. So let's try to talk about that right now. And what are strategies for the franchisor to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do? Because you're right, it's a very limited scope, but a franchisee is going to complain about it at some point if you're not doing what you're supposed to do. And like I said, I've had a lot of cases where you're promised so many hours of training and you only get 10 of the 40 hours that you're promised.
Promise nothing. Right? In short, right? Like promise as little as you can. With that being said, if you are putting it in your franchise agreement, it is an absolute must as a franchisor that you can deliver whatever you have put in your franchise agreement. So if you say you have a manual that matches what you're giving someone, or deliver the number of training hours. Promise as little as possible, though.
Right, but
Not in a bad way.
Right, but what are some strategies for ensuring that took place? For example, having a franchisee sign off that I received so much training. What are some suggestions for the franchisors to make sure that they've done what they're supposed to do and that the franchisee won't come back later and say, hey, I didn't get this, I didn't get that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously as an emerging franchisor, you're constantly trying to prioritize. You've got 8 million things that all demand your attention, right? And what one thing is it that you should be doing that, so I could certainly sit up here and tell you you should document everything, you should have it online, you should have it backed up, you should make sure that, you're getting franchisee testimonials that say, yeah, you did a great job with your training or whatever. The reality is that remember, most of our franchisees joined the system because they were excited about the opportunity, right? And somewhere along the way, if you're talking about compliance, either from the franchisee or the franchisor side, they lost that excitement, right? And it might be because they got into financial difficulties. It might be because, they feel slighted. It might be that things just didn't work out. Whatever it is, it's usually because of that, right? So, so the more you can, one of the ways to avoid, right, from both a franchisor and a franchisee compliance issues is to make sure that you have a very strong group of franchisees that are leading the system as well, that will back you up, that you are doing the things that you say you're doing or whatever, right? Because if a franchisee that is, that is claiming that a franchisor is in non-compliance is out on an island by themselves, it's very hard for them to get traction. But if they can rally a whole entire group around the idea that you're not providing some services, it's much easier for them to get traction in that way. So, again, obviously we can talk about all the documentation and things you should do and all that stuff, but I know that if you're 10 units and you're just trying to open your 11th and 12th and 13th and you're drinking from a fire hose, you're probably not thinking every day about like, hey, let me go back to my computer and type up these documents and make sure that everything's exactly tied out. But but really work to make sure that those people are happy, feel comfortable with the service you're providing them, and that will hopefully prevent some of those issues.
I think too, fortunately we live in a time now where there are plenty of software solutions out there that make this pretty easy to manage. And to the point of, when I say that you need to appoint a chief compliance officer, this could be the person who is the best administrative person at your underlying business, and you just bring them over as a shared service to the franchisor because they will be the one while you're drinking from the fire hose who will go in. And I can tell from personal experience, we managed it was a 3-figure franchise system, and as far as compliance tracking, it was a Google sheet. And all it was just those kind of things. Like, this franchisee completed training on this day. This franchisee has a site selection deadline of this date and an opening deadline of this date. A little bit of conditional formatting, and all of a sudden those dates turn yellow as the date approaches. And there's far more sophisticated systems now, like Fran Connect, and there's other ones out there. But you do have to have that system is only going to be as good as the dedication of the person that you have made accountable for maintaining it. So you got to have somebody who is going to have your best record keeper. If that's not you, and you are the guy who's drinking out of the fire hose, find your nerd in your organization and say, this is your job. I need you to be like militant about this, and they'll take care of it. They'll maintain it. But it doesn't have to be, you really don't need to overthink it, especially in the early days. You just have to have somebody who is accountable to it.
I'm waiting for the next question.
Okay. All right, I'll ask you the next question since you want it. So, Tony, what approach should the franchisor take when it identifies a compliance issue? For example, are there some terms that are negotiable or non-negotiable? Some issues like that.
I'm going to go back to my original. Everything to me starts and finishes with the business model that you've proven to work that you're selling to a franchisee. That is where it starts and ends. So everything that Jeff talked about that's in the franchise agreement, it's a proven system that you're selling, say, if you do this, this will happen. So there's anything that is required to make that system work is a non-negotiable. Other things are not. You say you have to do this, spend this amount in marketing, but there's a lot of marketing innovation. I don't want people to stop innovating on marketing in their local market, but there does need to be a certain percentage that's spent as an example. So there's things that are tight, that anything that has to do with the core business model. I did want to say something maybe related. If there's an early warning system. The early warning system is franchisee engagement that may, not always, but often leads to non-compliance. So we track who attends all of our things rigorously. So I have some of those I call them high attention to detail. We use caliper assessments, and the super high thoroughness people tend to be the compliance people in our business anyway. But you can track what some of your future problems will be, and then we try and head those off at the pass. But if you ask about negotiables, non-negotiables, anything that has to do with the, obviously, things like going to other people's territory, that's non-negotiable. But we just know there's 3 to 5 things, for example, in our home care business that just make it go that are just non-negotiable.
Anybody else?
Tony's got some good examples. I'll let him jump in.
Yeah, I actually think there's more like 3 categories. There's like the non-negotiables, there's like the things you don't care about, and then there's the stuff in between, and that's where it gets, so some of my investments are in restaurants, for example, and food safety is non-negotiable. Like, there's just no doubt. Like, if you run a restaurant business, you can't let your franchisees waver on food safety, and you got to be on them all the time, because not only will they destroy their restaurant, they'll destroy the whole brand if they get it wrong. So, like, that's an example where it's completely non-negotiable. But then there's stuff that works, right? And so you want to make sure that they're doing it. Like you said, Tony, there's the things that are fundamental to your concept that you understand work. So, like, if, for instance, you have a pricing strategy, I'll give one of my restaurant examples, where we have 2 different sizes of smoothies, right? And one is priced, $2 more. It's like, it's like a third more for $2 more, or whatever. So it's, so there's a implied value proposition there, right? And if you go to your franchisee and they just decide to price it at $4 more or whatever, they've ruined the implied value proposition. Like, it messes up the model. It doesn't seem like that big a deal, because what do I care what they sell it for, right? Except, and well, they'll only hurt their own sales, so then they'll listen and come back. Except that you don't want your franchisees to have to learn that thing for themselves, because you've already learned that. You already know that that's the optimal pricing for it. So that's why they bought into the system, because you already know those things. And in the past, what I've found is that sometimes within a small concept, in the desire to allow people to innovate some, which you do want, you're too often a little accommodating about breaking some of the core tenets of what makes your model successful. And so, so that's why I put in that middle group. It's not like the franchisee is going to ruin your concept by pricing it $2 more, but they are going to impact their business. And so, if you can clearly identify to yourself, like, what are the things that we know to be right, that we've already gone and tested, that we've already tried the alternatives and we know are right, then those are the things you really got to hold the franchisee compliant to, because they will ruin their economy, and then they won't be as happy, and then, and then you'll get into all this stuff about whose fault it was when they failed. Then there's the stuff like, the gentleman from Duncan who was up here, he talked about how some of his biggest, enhancements to his concept came from his franchisees kind of breaking the rules a little bit, right? And so you do have to be able to still be open to the fact that, like, occasionally a franchisee will come up with a much better idea than you ever had at corporate. So you don't want to stifle that entirely. But if you can convey to the franchisees that they bought into the system for the things that work, and that the things that you've already tested, you know to be true, those they have to follow. And then if they want to innovate in areas where, there's things that are changing, or they want to try something new, you can allow that. But make sure that you're pretty clear about where the differences are.
All right, so what about after you identify a default by a franchisee, what are some strategies to avoid, what are some strategies or things to think about before you serve a default notice? For example, you might not want to immediately default the franchisee, because that ruins the relationship, right? Once you serve the default letter, franchisee is going to get angry, probably lawyer up, right? So what are some strategies to deal with defaults without first sending a default notice?
Lawyer, ex-lawyer.
The ex-lawyer.
Okay, so an expression that I had a mentor pass on to me that I've always enjoyed is people don't sue people, they sue contracts. So as soon as the relationship is broken down to the point where the first thing we do none of you have franchise agreements. You all have franchise disagreements. They only come out of the drawer when you guys are fighting with one another. So if the default is to go and grab that agreement out of the drawer and start citing to section 6.2A3, you've lost the game already. So getting out in front of that, and to Tony's point about when you start to see that you have a large lack of engagement with your franchisee, that's a warning sign. Again, we are living in a really interesting time where we can have, and you should have, real-time reporting access to your franchisee's performance. You should have that key to a dashboard that says, hey, we know that if our brick and mortar brand is not generating at least X dollars in revenue per month, that franchisee is on a downward, like they are going to fly into the side of a mountain. And that needs to be something that you are getting out in front of. If by the time compliance issues like this pop up, they are symptoms, they are not the disease. So getting out in front of them by knowing what's going on with your system, knowing what level of engagement your franchisees have, identifying who are kind of our green lights, who are our yellow lights, who are our red lights, and then having somebody who is dedicated in your organization to moving as many yellows to greens as possible and as many reds to yellows. And if there are red lights in your organization, working on ways to peacefully exit them from the system before they start to metastasize and become a cancer within the organization. I think that if your default is to default and go legal right away, something is broken down well in advance of that. And I think as a franchisor, you kind of need to look inward.
I think that in my experience, there's different defaults. There is a default notice, and there's a default with the intent to terminate. And I look at those as two very different things. So in my experience, there are a few things that I go, it is an automatic default. If your royalty bounces to us any month, controller automatically sends a default notice. No, I don't care if they're going to come up with that money in 48 hours. It is going out, it is paper trailed. Period, end of story. That is, for me, one of the red lines. We're in home services, I don't have food. I would think if it was a food safety thing, I want a record of that. It is on paper, one page, electronically sent. I want that paper trailed. Unfortunately, if you bounce a royalty check, you may do it again. And I just want that out there. That is very different with where I would go, a notice of default with intent to terminate. Mm-hmm. So I think it's interesting to go, what are you defaulting for? And that would be one where I would go, for us, for me, if you bounce a royalty check, right? Or you bounce you don't have the funds in the account. That is an automatic default. Is that relationship getting broken? Sure. Doesn't mean I don't like you. Doesn't mean you didn't have intention of paying. But I think that those are very different things where you go, what are your red lines? And I'm usually pretty clear with the franchisees. I'm like, there's only a couple things where you're going to get me to send you a default letter on.
I think there's two little nuances in there that are really important too. You mentioned who is sending that letter. You said it was your controller, right?
Yes.
So it's not outside counsel, it's not
Nope.
legal, so you're not ratcheting up the conversation. And then any time that you're sending kind of these nasty grams or these default notices, whether it's a hey, get back in compliance, or hey, you are like highly violative of your contract right now, there's always the question of or what. And like I would be very cautious. If it is a, hey, you are delinquent on your royalties, the or what is, you need or what is the way that you can get back into compliance? Obviously, pay your royalties, we don't have a problem anymore. Be very cautious of sending out default notices that are laden with a bunch of threats that you are not willing to make good on. I would not sending out notices that you are going to, strip back territory rights, or you're going to bring all the fire and brimstone that your franchise agreement allows, but then you have no intentions of actually acting on those. assume that your franchisees are going to speak to one another, and now they're just going to think that you're always bluffing and that you're full of bluster. So I agree, Jeff. That's a great point of like having incremental defaults or things that are less than I'm going to terminate you, and then keeping. I mean, the good record keeping is a great point too. Put it in the file. They paid their royalty. They got back into compliance. Wonderful. However, you now have a record that says, hey, look, 3 times in the last year you've defaulted on these obligations, and you've got it's best record keeper wins. I'd rather you have it than not have it when you go to outside counsel to address a problem franchisee.
And you mentioned it. That's not Fisher Zucker, our attorneys on record, so it's not them sending the letter. It's not coming from me as well.
Right.
It's coming from my controller. So I think that is also who it's coming from as far as the notice goes. Mm-hmm. Because the controller she's in charge of the money, but it's not me.
And it allows you to come back in as good cop.
Yes.
You can bad cop to the attorney, you can bad cop to the controller, and then you come back in as the relationship guy and say, hey, Bob and Sally, guys, I mean, you know you can't not pay royalties, right? And then you can use that relationship capital to bring them back in compliance and leave poor Frank to be the asshole.
I was going to say, yeah, Ryan, you got a question?
Yeah, so I mean, I have a little bit different take on this because we're really careful about sending a default letter because it sends you down this slope of like, well, what if they don't respond to it? And then, okay, we send them another one, and what if they don't respond to it? And then, how many times am I going to let them go before we actually, really kick them out of the system or something? And is it really a kickable out of the system type of thing, right? I mean, unless it's one of those couple non-negotiables, like, it starts to become pretty tough to justify kicking somebody out of the system and taking away their livelihood over the fact that they didn't kind of comply to your standard or something, right? So what I would tell you is we look at the compliance a little bit like, I mean, I know everyone's aware of collection agencies, right? Have you ever seen how a collection agency goes about their business? They hound you. They just hound you, right? They'll, if you don't pay your bill, they'll call you, they'll send you letters, they'll send you, they just hound you. And because over time, eventually, you might actually pay them just to go away, right? And so I kind of look at like compliance a little bit like that. Like the reality is I get on the phone with a franchisee and I say, do you really want me to have to call you every single day about this? Like, is that what you want to be spending your time doing? Like, over what? Like, why are you not complying with this, right? Like, is it you don't have the money or whatever? Okay, well, let's talk about like how you can get the money so that you can comply with this. Is it because you're just lazy? Well, you've now answered the phone 5 times. Like, that's got to have taken you more time than it would have just to solve whatever I'm calling about. Like, my point is like a lot of times, a lot of this can be solved by just, sticking a hound on them. Like to some degree, the person who's very good at keeping track of it in the office can be very good at like sending out 8,000 emails too. Like just, like the pressure along, most people, not all, but most people feel guilty when they aren't complying with something, right? So like, as long as you're letting them know, and then you're talking to them in a reasonable manner about it, and you're not making it confrontational. You're trying to how do we resolve this problem together? Like, we're here to support you. What support do you need in order to resolve this problem? Like a lot of times you can just get them to compliance because they don't want to have to explain to you for the 15th time why they didn't do something, right? And so we try to address it much more that way than like going down the road of sending default and default and default, because then, like you said, there's a point at which you have to act on it, and it's a slippery slope.
And just for the record, that wasn't the first time, and it won't be the last time somebody called me an asshole.
I did want to comment on it because we mentioned. I know Jeff well enough that I know if someone defaulted, he'd probably want to know what their financials look like, and so someone's looking at financial review, or at least I mean, we come out of a culture that if someone's not paying something, you go back and there's a root issue, and we can't lose sight. And I know we use Traction and Entrepreneur Operating System in our business. So our L10s with our home care business, we're looking if that's happening, the whole company, everyone knows, and we say what's going on. And so you want to go to the root because we have all these development opportunities, and we have financial reviews that we do with each franchisee each month. So not to lose sight in compliance, it's getting ahead of the compliance, but once something happens, man, if it's happening twice, I mean, once is maybe an accident. Sometimes with large government contracts, they don't get paid in time, and there's some issues there, but usually they let us know. And that's the other thing. You go, hey, it's not going to be Tuesday, it's going to be Thursday. Take the money out Thursday, and that's what a good partner, and that's hopefully what you do. But I think if you got 3 in a year, you've got, it's beyond, to me, it's beyond a red flag. And there's some other root issues there.
All right, so one of the last subjects I see on our little description here is dealing with demand notices. So what happens when a franchisor receives a demand notice from a franchisee? What steps should you employ to investigate it and deal with it?
So this is an incoming demand letter. So the franchisee has retained counsel, and you now have a demand letter coming at you.
Well, they don't always retain counsel, but you get a demand letter from a franchisee claiming you've done something wrong. You gave me an FPR that you shouldn't have provided when I bought the franchise. You've breached your contract in some way.
Have you guys? I've been kind of out of the legal game for a little bit. Have you guys received a ChatGPT drafted demand letter yet? Are those floating around yet? They got to be.
They're coming,
right? I mean, I think there's a natural reaction, and I mean, having sat in the legal department when these demand letters come in, there is a very natural reaction to feel it becomes very ratcheted up very quickly, and it feels very adversarial. It feels very confrontational. I mean, you feel personally attacked, and there is a tendency to not realize that there is a bit of a cry for help that underlines what is inside of that demand letter, and it's very much like, well, you know, now it becomes a you versus them situation, and it's kind of like you never win a fight with your spouse, right? Like if one of you is hurting, both of you are hurting. So you never really win an argument. You never really win a battle with a franchisee. It's going to be hassle tax. It's going to be actual tax. I mean, it's going to be costly for the organization. There's going to be opportunity cost of dealing with it. So I think when those demand letters come in, first and foremost, definitely get your outside counsel at least on notice. You don't need to have them come in guns blazing and start putting pen to paper either, but at least get them on notice so that you can get a good example or a good idea of, okay, if this does go to litigation, you know, what is my exposure here? What are my disclosure? There might be some downstream consequences if this goes steps beyond just the demand letter phase. But, you know, above and beyond getting outside counsel involved, go find the stakeholders in your organization that are kind of being called out or being accused of things here, and just say, don't go to them with oh my gosh, you're not going to believe what so-and-so franchisee says you're doing. You just go to them and say, hey, tell me a little bit about what's going on with, you know, the local marketing deliverables that we've been sending to franchisees. Like, investigate with an open mind. You always have the ability to default back to, all right, now it's time to chest up and really like kind of, you know, be more confrontational about it. But if you go that route first, it's very hard to come back from that. I would find out what underlying truth is maybe in that demand letter before you like fire off a response, and certainly draft that email and then wait to send it the next day. Like, do not just fire back to that franchisee while you're in the heat of passion. Like, let cooler heads prevail before you reply.
Just my only comment on this is it doesn't necessarily have to be a demand letter. A lot of times it can just be an email. I mean, let's be clear. A lot of, the communication can just be, I mean, it's not as formal or whatever, but a lot of times it's just an email from a franchisee saying, I don't think you did what you were supposed to do, right? And, and what I would encourage is, to Drew's point, is, try not to get defensive, right? Because sometimes there's truth in them, right? And it may be an opportunity for your organization to learn something. And so one of the things that we try to do is if we get feedback from a franchisee, even if it's a problem franchisee, one that we know is, always complaining about this or complaining about that, we go to our better franchisees and we say, hey, how do you think we do on this? What do you, if you give us a score of 1 to 10 in this area, where would it be? And the reality is compliance is probably only about a 2 or something. But if your better franchisees tell you, yeah, you're really only about a 3 in that area, you got work to do, whether or not you're going to get sued over it or not. So that's sometimes a good opportunity, almost like they said, a cry for help or whatever. But sometimes it's a good opportunity for to learn where you do need to put some more work and effort in your organization and to make it better.
All right, well, we've got 3 minutes left. Do we have any questions from anybody? No?
I got a comment.
Okay, sure.
I've worked with Fisher Summit for many years, but this is an emerging franchisor conference, and the world of the emerging franchisor is so different than the mature brand. So the expectations you set when you're selling franchises are pretty important because there's a lot of choices out there. And when you're selling, eventually they're going to say, I'm sold on you. I'm sold on the brand. I'm sold on you. I'm sold on the system. And so it's hard to tell them we're not going to do anything for you. Because if you tell them that, especially the ones who are the more educated, the ones that can make your brand work, then you're not going to get it, number one. And number two, if you're an emerging franchisor and you're not on top of the attitude and the habits of your franchisees, you're missing the boat because you get warning signs so early when things aren't going well. And so there's a lot of reasons why it may be bad. They could have had a loss of a family member. They could have had a financial catastrophe in some other part of their life. So all these reasons why they may come out at you. But if you don't sit down with them and say, why are you doing this and what do we need to do to work this out? Bob Rosenberg sat in front of a huge IFA crowd 20 years ago and said, find a way to get them out. Just find a way to get them out because you're going to spend 10 times more energy and money trying to go through the path of default termination than you are just find a way to get them out. And I think culture is really important. And these guys here are all brand new franchisors who are looking for guidance on what to do to make sure their franchisee culture is right. So I'm not saying this directly to you, sir, but to say promise nothing, to me, that's anti-everything that franchising is now about. And I don't think you meant it literally, but I'm just asking that you guys think about the culture, treating your operators the right way, and have an early warning system. You know if something's wrong. You may not want to, maybe conflict at first, you don't want to deal with it, but just hit it right away. That's it.
So I'll just clarify. Franchise agreement, if you put it on paper as an obligation as a franchisor, you better be able to deliver it. Doesn't mean you don't do a lot of things, but I just caution anybody, what you are putting as a franchisor obligation, as minimal as possible. I think I've said this statement every Springboard or FLDC meeting to every new franchisor. There's a saying in franchising, you will do whatever it takes to get your first 10 deals done, and then you will spend the rest of your career trying to get out of those first 10 deals. Be careful. So when you say, if somebody's not following or just get people out, or be careful, I worry about new franchisors over-promising or putting too much in writing because they're so anxious. They want to do the right thing, but they may not know the long-term ramifications of that. So that's my caution, is just be careful, particularly what you put in writing. And when they send you the email, pick up the phone and call them. Don't put it in an email.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good tip.
As you're bringing on talent to be inside of your franchise system as a franchisor to help support your franchisees, one thing that I would make sure that you are hyper vigilant about anyone who has, really anyone in the organization, but anyone who has any sort of franchisee facing role, be hyper vigilant about franchisee contempt. If there is any air of contempt, if there's any air of it's them versus us kind of mentality, watch out for that. That will breed and that will spread through the organization. You need to have a very swift come to Jesus meeting with anyone who's on the franchisor side who is who's denigrating franchisees, who is talking poorly about them, who is exhibiting that kind of us versus them mentality. You need to get out in front of that. And if that's just part of who they are, they don't need to be in your franchise organization, because that will come through, that will become palpable. And it's amazing what one bad franchise business coach or one controller who takes the duty to default franchisees, takes it too far. Like, watch out for that franchisee contempt. It is not an us versus them mentality. You have to get that out root and stem.
I was just gonna make one comment on that too, Drew. I think it's a great point. Is that remember, you don't have a business without your franchisees, right? And so they can be emotional and they can be everything, right? But the reality is that they're your business. So like, it can't be an us versus them. It can't be, and that's easy to say. It's hard when, they're not doing what you want them to do, or you've talked to them 15 times or whatever. I mean, it can be frustrating, right? But you have to have the patience to keep working that relationship. The other thing that we've found that we've really started to refocus on. So in my dog training business, we have about 67 Zoom rooms across the country, and we grew very rapidly, kind of post-COVID. Pretty much about 60 of those are all within the last like 2.5 years. So that creates a lot of challenges, right? When you're growing that rapidly and trying to build the infrastructure and the support and the processes and all that stuff or whatever. And so you're going to make some mistakes and things like that. And one of the things we said was like, well, maybe we didn't bring on some of the wrong franchisees, and yeah, maybe we did, right? But then we turned it around and said, well, maybe we made this too hard on our franchisees, right? So sometimes compliance comes because you made it too hard on them. Like, you're asking a lot from people, especially people who this might be their first business, and it's easy to say, well, don't take anyone it's not their first business. Well, not everyone has that choice, right? If you're getting owner-operators, like, it might be their first business. They, hopefully they have other business experience, but running a small business is different from anything working in a job or anything else you've ever done, as most of you guys know. So you have this, dynamic where these people are in there for the first time and whatever, and like, we're asking them to, become an expert in our business. And then we're also asking them to become an expert in marketing, or we're asking them to become an expert in, in sales training, or we're asking them to become an expert in, and it's like, well, how many things can we really realistically expect them to do? So then you're like, well, they're not complying with this. Well, it's probably because they don't know how, or they haven't, they don't have the time because they're trying to do all these other things or whatever. So we have a big focus in our organization at this point about simplifying it, right? Like, the best franchise concepts are simple for the franchisee to operate. Then compliance, then if they're not complying, you're right. You're kind of like, guys, come on. I only ask you to do 5 things. Like, you can do those 5 things, right? But if you ask them to do 500 things, like, it's not surprising that they didn't do 10 of them. So simplification of the concept can go a long way too. So if you're seeing, like, things, start to ask yourself, do we really need our franchisees to do that, or is there a better way to do it? Because maybe that will help some with the compliance as well.
Thanks, that was great. All right, well, I think that's it. Let's give our esteemed panel here a round of applause. And thank you, everybody.